Okay, so we are in our part 2 of our learning the Rebbe's Zagada. So as we learned already last week, and we discovered the Rebbe's Zagada is very precise. Every word, every comma, every period of reading is absolutely precise, as we demonstrated last week, and we're going to see a little bit of that today as well. But it's a bit different. Last week, we focused more on a halachic issue, very halachic intense, and we didn't even cover half the things you wanted to get through. That's very intense halacha. And this week, the style of the Rebbe's writing is the same, that a precise language is there, and Rebbe gets to cutting to what is the essence of what's being said here. But this time, we're looking at just the narrative of the Haggadah, rather than the halacha of the Haggadah, right? Last week we discussed, where the Haggadah says it's a mitzvah to relay the story, we discussed what is the definition of that mitzvah. Now we're getting to the narrative of the story, and see how the Rebbe comments on the narrative. And again, when the Rebbe comments on the narrative, it's direct to the point, what is being said here? Which is why sometimes it's equally interesting what the Rebbe includes as what the Rebbe excludes from his commentary. What does the Rebbe leave out? Right? Ostensibly, the Rebbe's commentary is a collection, right? But sometimes you'll see he leaves things out. Why? That we'll have to think about also. And in the Rebbe's precise commentary, it includes history, the language, the wording, the grammar, as well as the halacha. And then we'll see in the precise language, the Rebbe finds the essence of what the spiritual messages. And that's a beautiful thing. That without even, mending the main basic meaning. Often what happens is when you get to a spiritual dimension of some passage, you have to stretch the direct translation of the passage to make it work with some drush idea, some midrashic idea, or some spiritual idea. But here, the spiritual message is going to be right in the text, which is very beautiful. So let's begin and let's see. So the first thing we're going to touch is a sort of historical halachic note on what's happening. And we're going to see how we get from the Mishnah to our very text. And instead of like we did last week, we looked at the Rebbe's text first and unpack it. We're going to do the unpacking first. So we're going to learn all the background, and then we'll see the Rebbe's comment, and we'll see what the Rebbe chooses and what the Rebbe doesn't choose. So let's begin. We start with the Mishnah in Pesachim, the last tractate of Pesachim, Perek Arvei Pesachim, chapter 10 of Tractate Pesachim, that deals with a description of the entire Seder night. B'ezrat Hashem, the plan is, I hope, after we finish Masech the Seder and our morning daily Gemara, we're going to learn this tractate. We'll learn that chapter, which goes through the order of the Seder, and we'll learn it together with the Code of Jewish Law. Remember what we did with Yom Kippur? It's a similar thing we'll do with the Seder night, God willing. So the whole Seder night is described in the last chapter of Pesachim. And there, it says the second cup of wine is poured, and then it says the 4 questions, and then the Mishnah concludes like this. Olafi daita shall aviv, there in English and in Hebrew. Olafi daita shall ben, in accordance with the knowledge, the intelligence of the son. Aviv malamdei, the father teaches him the response to the question. Now, what should the arc of the narrative be that it responds to the question? Says the Mishnah, maschil begnus, the story should begin with a place of shame. Here he translates as the Jewish people's disgrace. It should be a negative state. It's the arc of the narrative. And conclude with the place of praise, of glory, of positivity. That's how the Mishnah describes what the arc of the story should be. Negative to positive. I mean, this is the arc story of every Hollywood movie. There's a disaster, and at the end, there's everything's beautiful. So that's the storyline here. Start negative and positive. So we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. We'll see. We're going to get to that. So let's see. So gnus is a difficult word to translate. A couple of years back, we gave a class related to this, and some were discussing exactly how to translate the word gnus. Here they translated as disgrace. Elsewhere, I've seen it translated as shame. Elsewhere, I've seen it translated as negativity or difficulty. And then shvach is sometimes praise. Here it's glory, positivity, right? That's the arc of the story, negative to positive. And then a third thing, you begin to expound on the passage, which reads, my father was destroyed, an Aramaean, someone from Aram, destroyed my father. What this is referring to is there's a passage that the Torah says a person has to say when he arrives in the temple carrying his basket of the fruits, the bikurim. That passage is a brief history of the Jewish people, where the person comes and says, we went through all this history, and now finally we have our land, and now I have my fruit, so thank you very much. So the Mishnah says, take that verse, which has the narrative of the story, and expound on it. And that's what we do in the Haggadah. After the Mah Nishtana, and after the answer to the Mah Nishtana, we have Vehisha Amda, Baruch Shem Avtachas, blessed is the one who keeps his promise. And then we go into the paragraph which says, this is the promise that stood by us. And then right after that, we get into Aramed Ovid Avi, my father was destroyed by the Aramites, and we go on to that. We go on to those verses from that section where we thank Hashem with the basket, and the Haggadah explains each section. But we're not going to focus on that today. We're focusing on the first part, where the answer to the question should be in the arc of negative to positive. So comes the Gemara and comments. So you see, I put these little dots to tell you that this is not the full quote. The Gemara goes before and after. But the Gemara says, you can look at the English of the Hebrew. The Mishnah told us that the father, in answering the question, the storyline should be beginning with a place of shame, gnus, Messiah, and it should conclude with a place of positivity, of glory. So the Gemara asks, my bagnus, Jacob's question, what is a state of disgrace? So two opinions. Rav says, you begin with Mitechila of the Avodah Zarah. At the beginning, our forefathers were idol worshippers. So you go farther back than slavery. You go to idol worshippers. When were our forefathers idol worshippers? Before God chose Abraham. We think of Abraham as our forefather, but Abraham wasn't created from the earth like Adam. He was also born of parents. So his parents are also our forefathers. So our forefathers were also idol worshippers. And then God, you chose us. That's one way to look at the negative, positive narrative. Idol worshippers to believers in God. Not in God's service, yes, in God's service. The slavery and the freedom happens to happen in the middle. But the storyline you want to cover, says Rav, is go farther back and further forward. Farther back to the time when our forefathers were idol worshippers, and then presumably, we're going to see soon, maybe not exactly, but presumably conclude with Sinai, and now we're your people.
And the people here we're talking about
the Jewish people.
I understand.
Us.
I understand, but they're responsible for the what I mean.
Who said
even a nation yet.
Who said anything about responsibility?
Well, this race means that
it was our history is not
being punished for 200 years.
Who said no one said anything about punishment?
No.
Just the arc is that we were people who were unaware of Hashem's presence, and now we would be made aware. That's all. That's the story. No blame, no nothing. On the contrary, actually, as we'll see, they're not blame at all.
From Noah to Abraham, there was no knowledge of Hashem.
There was the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, right? But that wasn't the popular thing. It wasn't necessarily our forefathers. Avram and his father, we'll see soon. We'll get into more details of this. But certainly, Avram and his parents were idol worshippers, as we're going to learn more about that. So this is Rav's opinion.
If we're
sorry?
Levi, if we're going back that far, then on the other side, aren't we going back at the end of the Seder? We're looking way into the future.
Yep, that's right. So the second half of the Seder looks at the future. That's right. In fact, you're right in the sense that, to make your point even stronger, in the welcoming paragraph, when we say the halach manya, welcoming guest, we say now we're slaves, next year we're free people. So the story is going, the arc still goes, right? But the arc here in Rav's view is a spiritual one. We started off in a place of idol worship, and then we ended up with you, Hashem. So it's a spiritual arc of negative and positive. Where Shmuel says, you say, Avadim Hayinu, our forefathers were slaves, we were slaves. So Shmuel looks at the physical bondage and slavery, and then freedom. And Rav looks at the spiritual. We lacked knowledge of Hashem, and now we have knowledge of Hashem. Those are the two versions of the narrative. Okay, the Gemara continues. Top of page 2. Rav Nachman said to his servant Daru, with regard to a slave who is freed by his master, who gives him gold and silver, what should the slave say to him? So Daru, the slave, said to him, he must thank and praise his master. So Rav Nachman responded to his slave, if so, you have exempt us from reciting the questions. Why is this night different? As you have stated the essence of the Seder night, by us having this exchange about what a slave should be doing, we just fulfilled our obligation to ask and answer. We learned about that last week, right? So, having fulfilled our obligation to do question and answer, Rav Nachman immediately began to recite, Avadim Hayinu, we are slaves. So Rav Nachman is siding with the view of Shmuel that the primary here is the physical bondage. So this is the Gemara. So what's the halacha? What do we do? So let's look at Rambam. Look at Rambam. Rambam's laws of called Chametz and Matzah, the laws of Pesach, chapter 7, halacha 4. Next text on page 4. Yeah, we're clear so far? Page 4. I'm sorry, page 2. I don't know why I said page 4. It's halacha 4. It's page 2. The very next text. Okay. So the Rambam writes, one must begin the narrative describing our ancestors' base roots. You see here they translate it as base, but it means the negative. And conclude with their praise. What does this imply? One begins relating how originally in the age of Terach, our ancestors denied the existence of God and strayed after vanity, pursuing idol worship. And one concludes with true faith, how the omnipresence has drawn us close to him, separated us from the Gentiles, and drawn us near to his oneness. By the way, just so you know, this little line here, the Rebbe cites to this line as halachic proof that the Jews being the chosen people is not because we deserved it, but because God chose. From the language of Rambam right here, how does Rambam say it? Not the negative is we were idol worshippers, and the positive is we discovered you. Not what he says. The positive is you draw us near, you brought us close, you chose us. So this the Rebbe cites as a proof to this notion that the idea of chosen people is not because we chose and somehow we have value and that's what we're chosen. If we lose our value, we're not chosen anymore. But because Hashem plucked us out, and that's just who we are. They were cites to this passage in Rambam, and this might become relevant later in our discussion. Okay, so this is the version of Rav, right, which said that the ark has to be spiritual. Start off idol worship, and then we serve you Hashem. Okay, and then the Rambam continues, Maamorim continues similarly. One begins by stating that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt and describing all the evil done to us, and concludes with the miracles and wonders that were wrought upon us and our freedom. So Rambam writes, what do? Both. We do both. He says, and similarly, so we do both. We say this ark story of being foreign to Hashem and then close to Hashem, and we also say the story of slavery to freedom. But which of the two stories do we say first? So let's go through the Haggadah, just overview of the Haggadah. Go to the next page, page 3. This is the Haggadah. So the Haggadah opens up with, first we make Kiddush, just like every night. We mentioned this last week, just like every night, every Yom Tov night we begin with Kiddush. Afterward, the next thing is, we got to do things to cause the children to ask questions. So we dip. In order to dip, we have to wash our hands first. So we have Kaddish Orchas Karpas, right? And then the next thing we do is, we break the metal matzah. Again, we're making the kids curious why we're breaking matzah. We haven't eaten yet. We're putting it aside. And then once all that Kiddush is taken care of, the curiosity is taken care of, we launch right into the Mah Nishtana. First is a little welcoming paragraph, halach ma'anya, welcoming the guest, but then we get to Mah Nishtana. The kids ask the questions. As soon as the kids are done asking the question, we answer the question. What's the first passage we say after the children finish the question? What's the first paragraph we say? It's not a trick question. Avadim Hayinu. So what's the first answer we give to the question? What's the first narrative? Slaves. We don't describe first the spiritual freedom. We describe the physical freedom first. When do we get to the spiritual freedom? So this is how the Haggadah plays out. It says Avadim Hayinu. After Avadim Hayinu, it tells us, the Avadim Hayinu concludes, right? We can read the Avadim Hayinu very quickly in English. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. If the Holy One, blessed be, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we, our children's children, would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. So we tell the kid, look, you know why we're sitting at the table? Because God took us out of Egypt. We were slaves, and now we're free. And it's relevant to you, because if we didn't go out, we'd still be stuck there. Right? And therefore, even if all of us were wise, all of us understanding, all of us knowing the Torah, it is still a mitzvah upon us to discuss the Exodus of Egypt. And everyone who discusses the Exodus from Egypt at length is praiseworthy. So right from there, the next thing is a story about sages sitting all night learning. And that story, which remember we learned this last year, that story of the sages sitting and learning is proof that we have to sit all night. Because look, these guys know the whole Torah, and they're still sitting all night discussing the Seder, discussing the Exodus. This is the Haggadah timeline. After that, the Haggadah gets to the 4 sons. Right? And the 4 sons are an elaboration of the story of the Exodus, because the 4 sons are 4 different sons in the Torah that ask questions, right? There's 4 times when the Torah says, when your son should ask you a question, here's what you answer. And each time the Torah phrases the question of the child differently, and the answer differently. And that's how we deduce the 4 sons, right? And then once we're done all that, the Haggadah goes on to a little tangent about when it is you should start discussing the Exodus, whether you should start from Rosh Chodesh, Yochel Rosh Chodesh, or you should start from the night of Seder. But once it's done this, it then gets to the next paragraph, which we look on page 4, the English. In the beginning, our fathers were served idols, but now the omnipresent one has brought us close to his service, as it said. Josh, right? So now we're saying the next narrative. Following? Right after the boy said the Mah Nishtana, the question was asked, we gave him the first answer. We were slaves, now we're free. We went in a little tangent to discuss this notion that we actually have to elaborate on the Exodus. And we went on a little tangent to discuss the 4 different types of questions and the 4 different answers. And now we're coming back to the second version of the narrative. In the beginning, our fathers served idols. The spiritual one. Our beginning, our fathers served idols. But now the omnipresent has brought us close to his service. And we quote a verse that this happened. As it says, now this is Yeshua gives a speech to the people. So the whole next 2 paragraphs is a quote from the verses. Even though, by the way, let's just read the verses. The verse reads, as Joshua said to the people, thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, your fathers used to live on the other side of the river. Terach, the father of Avram, and the father of Nachar, Avram's brother, they served other gods. And I, says Joshua, quoting God, took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through the whole land of Canaan. I increased his seed and gave him Isaac, and Isaac gave to Jacob, and to Esau I gave Mount Seir to possess it, and Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. Now, actually, the verses in Joshua keep on going on to describe the slavery and the Exodus. But the Haggadah doesn't continue quoting those verses. It stops. Because the Haggadah is intent on what? The narrative of slavery to freedom. We already took care of that in the first paragraph. What's the Haggadah intent on right now? Just the second narrative. Served idols, and now it's serving Hashem. So the very next verses, right? We just quoted a verse from the book of Yeshua. The very next verses go on to say, and then God sent Moses and took you out of Egypt. But that part's not in Haggadah, because that's not relevant right now. Is following? So these are the 2 paragraphs, or the 3 paragraphs that make up the fulfillment of the mandate of the Mishnah. To begin with negative and go to positive. Clear? Okay. Okay, so now that we know this, the Haggadah first does the physical bondage, the physical narrative, and then goes to the spiritual one, with a break of a little tangent in the middle. But let's go back to the Gemara on page 1. Yeah, what did the Gemara say? What was the order?
Seems to be the reverse. Huh?
Oh, it was taught in the Mishnah. The Gemara asked, what is the meaning of the term with disgrace?
Spirituality.
Rav said, one should begin by first, at our forefathers were idol worshippers. And Shmuel said, to begin with, we were slaves. So which one does the Gemara put first?
Spiritual.
Which one does the Gemara put first? Look in the Gemara on page 1. Which one does the Gemara put first? Not the Haggadah. Which one does the Gemara put first?
The spiritual.
But which of the 2 opinions? Rav Amar, Mitechila, Davod, and then it brings the Avadim Hayinu. We put Avadim Hayinu first. Why? We put the slavery first.
In the Gemara.
In the Haggadah, we put the slavery first.
Yeah.
And then the story of idol worship. Whereas the Gemara has it in the reverse. Why is that? So there's a number of different ways to approach this, and we're going to look at a few of them. Sorry?
Why is it a given necessarily that they both have to start and finish with the same premise?
The Mishnah said that. The Mishnah said, Maschel b'gnos and Mishnah b'shvach.
The Mishnah.
The Mishnah said, begin with derogatory and end with positive. And the Gemara is commenting on what the version is. Which, by the way, which tells, just an aside, we're just reading, not an aside, but it's going to come up also important later, but the paragraphs which begin with our ancestors were idol worshippers, and now they serve God. What's the verse? How does the verse describe it in Joshua? How does the verse describe it in Yeshua? I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him throughout the whole Canaan. And it stops there. It doesn't go on to Egypt. So where does it begin where Hashem takes the people? Where? Not at Sinai, Avraham. Right by Avraham. Mm-hmm. So yeah, look at the Haggadah. VoEkach Chasavim. That's it. That's the end of the narrative. I took your father Avraham.
But only Avraham.
And then from him onward, all of his children. And I gave him seed. I gave him Yitzchak. I gave him Yaakov. So which means the narrative of beginning with slave idol worship and ending with serving Hashem is not pre-Egypt, post-Egypt at Sinai. That's all pre-Egypt. All of it pre-Egypt. It's Avram. Avram, his father, Terach, idol worshiper, and Avram chosen to serve Hashem. That might be, I haven't seen this written anywhere, but that might be why the Haggadah chose to put Avadim Hayinu first. Because the kid's asking why we're sitting at the table. What does Avram being now serving God do while we're sitting at the table? We're sitting at the table because of the slavery. So put that first. And then, maybe. But I haven't seen that written anywhere. Maybe one of the answers is similar to this. Okay. So let's go to, a lot of time here. Okay, let's look at the middle text on page 4. The Ritva, we can see Rabbi Yomtiv ben Avram, I'm not sure I pronounced that, known as the Ritva, from, Asavili, yeah, from Spain, circa 1260, 1314. So he says like this. This is a commentary in the Haggadah. The Rebbe does not cite this commentary, this passage, in his discussion. And to the best of my knowledge, the Rebbe does not cite the Ritva at all throughout the entire Haggadah. I didn't read through every single line, but I did do like a little word search on some of the online versions, and I could not find Ritva, as well as looking in the index at the back of this one and don't see Ritva. So maybe the Rebbe didn't have it. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly. The Rebbe did not quote the Ritva for whatever reason. Anyway, the Ritva says like this. Haggadah, this passage of Avadim Hayinu is the beginning of the story. The Tshuvas Mah Nishtana, and the response to the Mah Nishtana. Lafi, because the reason you're asking why is this night different than why we're here, here's the answer. Etc. Because we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt and so on. Now, of Gemara Amrum, the Gemara says, we learned the Gemara earlier, Maskal B'Gnus, the person should begin with the place of negativity, and the story should end with positive. Why is that? Law says, this is a way of giving praise and thanks to God. And he quotes a verse that God raises up the destitute from the depth, from it took us out of nowhere. So the story is more glamorous, and the thank you to Hashem is more glamorous when we began in a place of negativity, and here we are at the heights of the world. Yeah. Now the Gemara disputes Magnus. What is the point of negativity? Which is interesting. The Gemara doesn't discuss where the narrative ends. The Gemara only discusses where's the beginning of the narrative. Right? And one version was the beginning of the narrative is slavery, and the other version was that the beginning of the narrative is idol worship. The conclusion of the narrative, the Haggadah gave. Right? But the conclusion of the narrative is not directly in the Gemara, just to note. The screen isn't showing? I'm sorry, I don't know why that is. No, I'm talking about for the viewers.
I'm just seeing the title page.
Just the title page?
Yeah.
And now?
Just layers of Haggadah is all I see.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It doesn't matter for me, but you're recording.
Okay. I hope it comes out well. Okay. So the Gemara discusses, my gnus, what is the nature of this derogatory? Rav says, Mitechila. You begin with the paragraph that says, at the beginning, which is the paragraph that says our forefathers were slaves. Rava says, Avadim Hayinu, you begin from our ancestors were slaves in Egypt. Umaskana kavasei, and halacha follows Rava. The Hava Basra, because he was last. So what does the Ritva say? Which one of the two paragraphs should you be saying? Avadim Hayinu? There's a dispute in the Gemara. Which paragraph do you say? Do you say Avadim Hayinu or do you say Mitechila? And here he says, it's Rav and Rava arguing, which by the way, in our version of the Gemara was Rav and Shmuel. But here it's Rav and Rava. Interesting. And Rava comes after Rav, and whoever comes last, halacha follows him. And therefore, we do Avadim Hayinu. That's the halacha. This would explain why Avadim Hayinu is first. And he goes even more. But Rav Nachman Ovid Kavasei, B'Ovdei Dedaru Avdei. In the story that the Gemara relates of Rav Nachman, who asked his slave, what would a slave have to do if their master let them free with gold and silver? And the slave said, well, you have to thank him. And then Rav Nachman said, we fulfilled their obligation for question. Now let's get to the answer. And he started saying Avadim Hayinu. So Rav Nachman clearly followed the opinion of Avadim Hayinu as the proper narrative, not Mitechila. Mitechila being the paragraph which describes our idol worship. Yeah? So, and now the Ritva says an interesting thing. Mistabra would seem correct to me. It would seem to me, says the Ritva, that the dispute is not a question of which paragraph do you say, but they're arguing as to which one comes first. So Rava, which says you begin with Avadim Hayinu, is not saying to do Avadim Hayinu and not to describe the fact that we were idol worshippers. He's saying do both, but do the slavery first, and then discuss the idol worship issue. And Rava is saying no, first do the idol worship, and then do the slavery. Now, if that's the dispute on order, then our Haggadah makes perfect sense. Because our Haggadah follows the second opinion, which Ritva just told us is Rava, and Rava comes later. So we follow him and do Avadim Hayinu first, and then the story of idol worship.
But we don't do it that
We do it that way. We start with Avadim Hayinu in the Haggadah. What's the first paragraph we say after the Mah Nishtana? Right? Avadim Hayinu, we're slaves. That's the first thing we do. After a tangent, then we get to Mitechila, the idol worship story. Right? So we follow that order. So it's before the Ritva, we were learning that they're mutually exclusive. If you're doing Avadim Hayinu, you're not doing Mitechila. If you're doing Mitechila, you're not doing Avadim Hayinu. And now Ritva is telling us, no, they both agree you do both. It's just a question of which one comes first. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, we are decidedly following Rava, who says to do Avadim Hayinu first. Clear? Okay. So this is Ritva. Now let's get to the next text, answering the same question. This comes from the Imrei Shefa, that's the name of the book. And the scholar is known as the Netziv. Netziv, Nun Tzadik Yud Beis, stands for Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Famous Netziv. Okay. So let's see what he says. Look after the parentheses there, after the on the second line, after the question mark. His answer to the question, right? He's asking the same question we've been asking. Why are we doing Avadim Hayinu first? Why are we doing Avadim Hayinu first? When seemingly he asks it from a different angle, right? The Ritva said that the disputants are Rav and Rava. And therefore we follow Rava, which says Avadim Hayinu first.
Yeah, Rav.
Sorry, Rav and Rava, just names.
Oh, okay.
The names. Rav and Rava. Whereas our Gemara says Rav and Shmuel. Now the halacha is that if Rav and Shmuel dispute, then in cases like this, we follow Rav. In cases of law relating to money, we follow Shmuel. But in any other law, we follow Rav. Okay. So Rav said we begin with Mitechila. We begin with this idol worship. Shmuel said we begin with Avadim Hayinu. Right? So now the question becomes, why are we following Shmuel? So according to the Ritva, we were answered because according to the Ritva, it wasn't Shmuel, it was Rava. Right? But according to the original text of the Gemara as we know it, it's Rav and Shmuel. We should be following Rav, which says to do the idol worship story, not the slavery story. Mm-hmm. So why are we doing both and putting slavery first? Following the question? So it says the Netziv, Ela Vadai, it would seem clear, L'kula Alma, to everybody, it would seem to me, says the Netziv, that even before the Mishnah was written, and even before the Gemara was written, the Haggadah as we know it was already established. So everybody did it exactly as we do it. Now, what is clear before we continue the Netziv, and this will come up again later, what is clear is that the paragraphs of Avadim Hayinu, that text, and the text Mitechila, which describes at the beginning our forefathers were idol worshippers, that clearly did exist before the Gemara was written. How do we know this? Because the Gemara doesn't quote the whole text. It just makes reference to it. Begin with Avadim Hayinu. Without telling you the rest of the words, meaning they're expecting the reader to already know about it. In fact, as we're going to see soon, the Jerusalem Talmud says Avadim Hayinu, etc., Mitechila, etc., meaning you know the rest of it, which means these paragraphs already existed. So says the Netziv, probably they have that God exactly as we did. Avadim Hayinu with the digression and then the Mitechila. So then what's their dispute if we have the text already? What's the nature of the dispute? So Ella Shachalkim B'Pirush Mishnah. Rav and Shmuel are not arguing about law. Which one should you say? Because of course you got to say it exactly as we know it, because that's the printed, whatever version of text they had then. Whatever version of print, handwritten manuscripts, whatever it was. But the Haggadah was already set forth. And then it's Siv's view.
Which one comes first?
But the question, not even which one comes first, because the order is also already set in stone. That's what it's just arguing. So it says, that's what the Ritva said, the argument is which one comes first, right? That was the Ritva.
Right.
Then it's saying, they're not arguing the law at all. They're just arguing in how you understand the Mishnah, not law. They're not arguing the law, they're just arguing in how you understand the Mishnah. Namely, Rav Sfirole, Rav says, the Al-Maimer Avadim Hayinu l'tnan l'fi daita shel ben avim melamde. What he's saying is like this. What he's saying is like this. Let's go back to the Mishnah for a second. Let's understand the mitzvah without reading the whole thing. Back to the Mishnah, top of the page. Top of the first page. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said 3 things. Answer your son according to his intelligence. Number 1. Number 2, begin with shame and end with praise. And number 3, expound on the verse, Arami Oived Avi, this verse that the Jews would say when they would go to the temple with the basket. Yeah? So it says in its like this. They should be seen as 3 separate items. And if the question becomes, which paragraph in the Haggadah matches which of these 3 items? Following? So the last one is clear because there's a whole section in the Haggadah that expounds on the verses of Arami Oived Avi. That's clear. But when it says that the father should teach to the child in accordance to his understanding, and then it says begin with shame and go to positive. Is shame and positive a description of how you talk to your son? Or is that a separate issue? One thing is talk to your son. Number 2, say a story that begins in positive and begins in shame and goes to positive. Now, if you understand it, that there's 2 separate instructions here. Number 1, talk to your children. That would be Avadim Hayinu. And that's why from there we go on to the 4 sons. And then instruction number 2 is say a narrative of negative and shame, of shame and positive. And that would be our fathers were ancestors. Following? Idol worshippers. Yeah? Following? So therefore when Rav says that when that begin with shame, end with praise means the paragraph of idol worship, he's not saying that that's how you should answer your child. He's saying in addition to answering your child by Avadim Hayinu, you should say this in conjunction with the Mishnah which said begin with shame and go to positive. In addition to answering the question. And that's why the order is Avadim Hayinu, answer the question, and then are we idol worshippers? Whereas Shmuel, which says that the idea of begin with shame and end with positive is the story of slavery, Shmuel understands that the injunction to begin with shame and end with positive is the way in which you answer your children. Namely, Avadim Hayinu. Following? So they're not arguing in the halacha. They're arguing in just understanding the Mishnah. Which item in the Haggadah does what? This is the Nitziv. Clear? So far, so good? Okay. You're clear with me?
It's heavy, but
Sorry?
I say it
It's
is
a
heavy.
bit hard to
Sorry?
follow it, but it's just that last part.
The statements of Rav and Shmuel like this. What did Rav say? Rav said, the Mishnah said, begin with shame, end with positive. And they argued on what shame is. Is shame slavery? Or is shame idol worship? That's all they said. So then it's saying that, who said that has to do with the answer to the question of the kids? Maybe it's a separate injunction. Number 1, answer your kids the question. That's Avadim Hayinu. Number 2, tell a story that begins in shame and goes to positive, which is what we do. Begin in shame, idol worship, and end in positive. Now we serve Hashem. And that is Rav's view. And that's exactly what we do in the Haggadah. We answer the question of Avadim Hayinu, and then we get to positive and shame and positive. Where Shmuel says no. When it says to do shame and then positive, that's a description of your answer. And therefore that goes on Avadim Hayinu. But they're not arguing what you do. You say the whole thing anyway. It's just a question of which paragraph belongs to which thing. It's like a little jigsaw puzzle. That's all it is. Right? Okay.
What is attributed to?
Exactly. What's attributed to what? Exactly right. So now, what do we have so far? According to the Ritva and the Nitziv, according to both of these views, we would conclude that in times of the Mishnah, what were they saying? Everything. According to both the Ritva and the Nitziv, in the times of the Mishnah, they were saying everything. Exactly as we're saying it. According to the Ritva, maybe they were saying it in a different order if they followed Shmuel. But everybody agrees that they were saying everything that we have in the text. Following? Yeah? Meaning the halacha that we do both is already at the time of the Mishnah.
Well, you said it was in the Jerusalem Talmud, right?
The Jerusalem Talmud also brings it as a dispute, right?
Oh, it does?
The text already exists, but the question is, what were people saying? Which one of the texts were they saying? So far, the arguments were that they were doing both.
Mhm.
Just a question of which order, and according to the Netziv, everybody was doing it in the same order, just a question of what are they attributing to what. But certainly, they were saying all the paragraphs, even at the time of the Mishnah. Right? Even though the Gemara presents it as a dispute, should you say this one or should you say that one? In reality, according to these views, they were doing both. They're arguing about the meaning of the Mishnah, how do you attribute which paragraph to what, or they're arguing about which order, but everybody agreed they were doing both at the time of the Mishnah. Clear? Yeah? Clear on this so far? Okay, so now we come to the Rif. On page, what page is it? Page 5, top page 5. The Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Afasi, who is the precursor to the Rambam. He says like this in his comment on the Gemara. Second line there. My gnus, what's the meaning of shame? He quotes the dispute as we know it. Amar Rav says, Mitechila oivdei avodah zarah. At the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. And Shmuel says, Avadim, we are slaves, right? He brings the dispute. What does the div say? V'ha'idna, and nowadays, of dinon, we do katarvayu like both. Stressing the word nowadays. What does that mean? It means at times of the Mishnah, there was a dispute. Just like Beis Shammai and Hillel about how you like the menorah, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And for generations, the Mishnah tells us, the Gemara tells us, there was argument. Half the places doing it this way, half the places doing it that way. So the Rif, until at some point, we all concluded to do a Hillel. So the Rif is telling us that in the times of the Mishnah, they did dispute over how to do it. Either they said Avadim Hayinu, or they said Mitechila. And nowadays, we do both. Clear? Same thing with the Rosh.
Well,
And that's-
Avadim Hayinu is still first.
So that's the question. According to the Netziv and the Ritva, we know why we do Avadim Hayinu first. We do Avadim Hayinu first because according to the Ritva, we're following Rava, which put Avadim Hayinu first. That's right. Because his version was Rav and Rava arguing, not Rav and Shmuel, and that's why we're following Rava. And according to the Netziv, we're doing it exactly the way they always did. However you attribute it, doesn't matter. We're doing it exactly as they always did, right? But now that we just discovered that according to the Rif, and the same thing with the Rosh, in the times of the Mishnah, it was an actual dispute. Some were doing Avadim Hayinu, and the times of the Gemara also. Some were doing Avadim Hayinu and not Mitechila, and some were doing Mitechila and Avadim Hayinu. Why are we doing Avadim Hayinu first? Especially if it's Rav and Shmuel arguing, and when Rav and Shmuel argues, we follow Rav, and Rav says to say idol worship, not slavery. So even if we're going to do both, we should put Rav first. This is the question the Rebbe addresses. So if we started from the Rebbe's commentary, we could have unpacked it going this way, but instead, the whole background and then to the Rebbe's commentary. This is the Rebbe's question. Following? Okay. The Rebbe cites the other sources, and we'll put that on the side right now, because as I remember I told you last week, that the way in which the Rebbe cites the sources also tells you something about the sources. Sometimes the Rebbe tells you, see there, which means go think about what it says there, because it's not exactly clear. And sometimes the Rebbe just puts the name, like statement, Rif source, Rosh source. But the Rebbe adds 2 more sources, and in those 2 sources, the Rebbe says, Re'eh, go see. And when you look it up, it's a bit different. And each time the Rebbe does that, it's mamish precise like this. Every single time the Rebbe introduces a text with the word Re'eh, see, it's because the source text is not exactly as he said it, but almost like what he said it. And that's why he puts the word Re'eh, see. And then sometimes he tells you ayin, which means like really investigate, because it's really difficult to see in there how it comes to what I'm saying. So literally every word is precise in the Rebbe's Zagada. But maybe we'll get to that soon. So now let's go to the Rebbe's comment, because I'm running a little bit out of time, and I want to cover more ground. So I want to get to the practical stuff of today's day. On page 7, I put a table of the various different versions of the authors of the Mishnah, of the authors of the argument. Rabbi Hananel says it's Rava and Rav Yosef, and if the halacha follows it, Rava. According to the Ritva and the Maggid Mishnah, it's Rava and Rava. According to the Abudraham, it's Rava and Abaye. According to Shmuel, according to the Amram Goyen, not 100% clear, we didn't get to look at that text, it's Shmuel and Rav. And according to the Rif and Rosh, we saw earlier, it's Rav and Shmuel. Right? And then in each one I put on the bottom, who should the halacha follow? And therefore, in every single one, it follows well, except for the one on the right-hand column, Rif and Rosh. Because Rif and Rosh have the argument as Rav and Shmuel, and Rif and Rosh are of the view that the argument is exclusive, in that even at the time of the Mishnah was split, And the question becomes, according to Rif and Rosh, why do we begin with Avadim Hayinu, which seems to follow Shmuel's view, when we should really be following Rif's view? We should really be following Rav's view. And Rav's view is to begin with idol worship. Very clear? So let's go to the Rebbe's comment on the bottom of the page 7. Okay. So Avadim Hayinu. You see the Rebbe's comment there? Okay. So first the Rebbe cites to the source of why we're saying Avadim Hayinu. Key, because Maschel Begnus, we must begin with shame. This word key, which means because, is not in the Gemara. I don't know where they ever got the word key from and why it's there.
What is key?
Key means because. Does it ever mean because? I saw in Abu Draham, in one of the other commentaries, where it says that the Avadim Hayinu should be read as, it says like this, that if you're reading the Avadim Hayinu as an answer to the kids' questions, the kids asking why we're here, so you answer because we were slaves. That's what the Abu Draham says. So maybe that's why they would put the word key. As in, when you're saying the story, you should be saying, because we were slaves. But it's not 100% clear because Rebbe writes, Ki masla begnus, because we start with negative, we start with shame. What is because we start with shame? That's why we say Avadim Hayinu. That's why we say we were slaves. I'm not sure why they would put that word there. Anyway, so then the Rebbe goes on to quote the Gemara, my begnus, what's the meaning of the shame? And he quotes the dispute we mentioned earlier. Rav says, Mitechila that shame begins with idol worship, which we will do in a couple of pages from now. And Shmuel says, Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves, which is the paragraph we're reading right now. We were slaves in Egypt, yes? Rabbi, you with me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just looking at the chart. So we're on the right hand of the chart.
We're on the right hand. That's what we're following right now.
Okay.
We want to resolve our right hand.
Okay.
Yeah? Now says the Rebbe, Va'idna, and nowadays, Avdinon Ketervayu, we do follow both opinions. Now look in the parentheses. His two sources are Rif and Rosh. Those are the two opinions that were directly responsible for their statement. That today we do both, and they both, Rif and Rosh, have the version of the Gemara of Rav and Shmuel. Then the Rebbe says, Ayin Sham, investigate there, Pirush Rabbeinu Hananel, and Abu Draham. Doesn't just say, look, doesn't just put them there as sources. It says, see there, Ayin Sham, look into it. And if you look there, they also indicate that the dispute was resolved later, but not at the time. But they don't have Rav and Shmuel to dispute. They have other ones that dispute. And that's perhaps, yes, and that's perhaps why the Rebbe puts, Ayin Sham, look there. Because even though they support my contention that the argument was mutually exclusive at the time of the Talmud, and only nowadays we do both, they support that notion, but the version of the Gemara they have is different than mine.
It's opposite. Right?
It's opposite, exactly.
Oh, Rava and the
Exactly. But they all indicate at the time of the Gemara was a dispute, and only nowadays we do both. Clear? Yeah? Okay. Rebbe continues. Yesh Garson, others say that the opinion which says to do Avadim Hayinu is Rav. And he gives a source, which we're not looking up right now, although it's earlier up in the text. Oi, another version says Rava. Oi mer Avadim Hayinu, skip the parentheses. Other versions say that it's Rav or Rava who say to do Avadim Hayinu. V'im kain, and if it's correct that Rav is the author of that statement, and Rav is the author of that statement, Shaprim and Ogenu, our custom makes sense. Ki hilchas hakara b'yisura, because we follow Rav when it comes to issues that are non-monetary. The hilchas hakara and the halacha always follows Rav. So they conclude by saying that yes, indeed, if you follow Rif and Rosh, you should be doing Mitechila first. But because there are different versions which say it's Rav and Rava, that's why we do Avadim Hayinu first. Yeah, this is what the whole package we're unpacking. Now says the Rebbe, Umash Perush b'Sefer Imrei Shefer LaNetziv, that which the Netziv writes in the book Imrei Shefer, which we read earlier, where we just read before. What does he say? That everybody always had the Haggadah as we have it, with Avadim Hayinu first and then Mitechila, first slavery and then idol worship. They all had that. They're just arguing about which one's attributed to what. Says the Rebbe, Tamua. This is a very curious commentary to me. I have 4 sources, at a minimum, who all say that in the times of the Gemara, there was an actual dispute which paragraph you should say. And it's only post-Talmudic times that we decided to combine. And you here in the Tziv are just as if like he's an instant 17th century rabbi who just negates early halachic decisors. Right? Moreover, if you look at the dates of when they lived, right? Look at the dates of, if you go up to top page 6, you see that Abraham lived in 990 and 1053. Sorry, that's Ibn Hananel. No, not Abraham. No, I mixed up. I mixed up the names here. The quote is actually from Abraham, but Ibn Hananel lived in 990 to 1053. And if you go to page, oh man, I didn't put there. Avadim date. The Rashi lived in 1250 to 1327. Ibn Yitzchak Alfasi lived in 1013 to 1103. So we're talking about within a century and a half after the Gemara. If they use the words, nowadays we do both, maybe they have some insight as to what was happening before their time. You can't come 1,000 years later and say, oh, this dispute we have now, this version we have now, always was here, and ignore people who lived 1,000 years before you who said that no, only nowadays we do it together. So even though what you and Tziv said is very nice, but 1,000 years ago, we have indication that it's only nowadays that we do both. And you're saying, no, it was always like this. You can't do that. You following? That's what the Rebbe's argument is. Rebbe doesn't say that he's arguing from a point of history, but it would seem to me that that's correct. It says, it's curious to me that he maintains that there was never a dispute in what you say, and they always said it exactly as we have it. Shusoi said this contradicts Lamasha of that which is written in the Rif, Ibn Hananel, Abudraham, and the Rosh, who are all 1,000 years before you, at least. Almost 1,000 years. How many years is it? 1800s to some of them are almost 1,000. Other ones are 900, 800 years. Val Kaponim, and at the very least, says the Rebbe, then Tziv should have mentioned them. Even if he's going to disagree with them, he should have at least said, there are people who lived 800 years before me who said that the dispute existed in times of the Talmud, and only after the Talmud they decided to combine. Right? But according to what we were saying earlier, that there's different versions to the Haggadah, and that some versions don't have it Rav and Shmuel, they have it Rav and Rava, they have it Shmuel and Rav. According to those versions, it makes sense why we put Avadim Hayinu first, because the halacha follows Rava, who says Avadim Hayinu, and the halacha follows Rav, according to that version, who says Avadim Hayinu. Instead of trying to write history from 1,000 years ago into a text you have from today. This is Rebbe's comment number 1. Yeah? Now let's go to... This ends part 1, even though we didn't go through all the sources, but you get the picture of what Rebbe did here.
Based on regions, different regions, based on Rav, where they were living.
Okay, that's a good point. But Rif, that's a good point. And maybe that's why they quoted these sources, because Ibn Hananel, Rif, and Rosh all lived in different places. Mm-hmm. Abudraham and Rif both lived in Spain, but the others lived everywhere else. And also, the Gemara is, and also they were cited earlier too of Amnon Goin, who came from the same place as the Gemara. In Bavel, I'm talking about. Yeah. So if they are saying, nowadays this is what we do, then it's probably because it wasn't always like this. And they know that nowadays we do this. So you shouldn't just willy-nilly say that, the way we have it now is always like this. Mm-hmm. When you have people 1,000 years ago saying, no, it wasn't always like this. Following? That's what it seems to me. Okay. And therefore, says the Rebbe, because the halacha follows Rav and Rava according to those versions of the Gemara, Misada Haggadah, the Haggadah is organized where Avadim Hayinu comes first. Even though the story told to us in the paragraph about our ancestors were idol worshippers, predates the events of us being slaves. Because our forefathers being idol worshippers is in Avraham Avinu's time. Terach. Okay. So this is comment number 1 from Davod. Now we're going to skip the next 2 comments, and we'll go to, on the left-hand side, the last paragraph there, the next comment from the Rebbe. Now, Haggadah goes on to say, first of all, Haggadah says, you want to know why we're sitting here? You're asking, child? Because we were slaves, and now we're free. And if God didn't take us out, we'd still be here. Yeah? So what's the exact, what? Let's see the word. Let's see the Rebbe's comment. The words of Haggadah are exactly, Hare anu uvanenu uvnevanenu, us, our children and children's children, mishubadim hayinu, we would be slaves, lafarai to Pharaoh, but Mitzrayim in Egypt. We would literally be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. What is going on? Let's hear a beautiful comment from the Rebbe. And this is comment number 1, where we're going to see how the Rebbe is going to take the literal meaning and give it a beautiful spiritual message. This is comment number 1 where the Rebbe is going to do this. There's going to be another comment where the Rebbe is going to do this even stronger. But let's see. So last paragraph on the left. Kamuvan, obviously, after the Rebbe quotes in the italics the Haggadah, the Rebbe writes, Kamuvan, obviously, Eina Kavana, the intention is not in the Haggadah, Lapare should be Moshe, that we would be slaves to the actual Pharaoh who lived in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. That would be blessing him with a very long life, talking about 3,500 years. So obviously we don't mean that guy. Yeah? Ella, but, Shekol Malchim Mitzrayim, all the Egyptian kings, Nikru B'Shem Klali, were referred to by this general term, Parai. Like you have the Caesar, the Tsar, the Sultan, the Pharaoh. Yeah. Now, but the Rebbe continues. Even though by the time the Mishnah was written and the Haggadah ratified sometime around then, this custom that the Pharaoh should be called pharaohs is gone. Today, certainly the president of Egypt is not called Pharaoh, and even in times of the Mishnah, the person who ran Egypt was not called Pharaoh. So why would the Haggadah say we would be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt? And the Rebbe continues, in the parentheses, this is indeed Abudraham's question. And therefore, the Abudraham tells you to take the word lafare out. He just says we would be slaves in Egypt, not we would be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Because Pharaoh is gone already. The notion of the Pharaoh is long gone. So just say we would be slaves in Egypt, not slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. This is what the Abudraham says. But says the Rebbe, Yeshlemer might suggest, and here comes a beautiful explanation. The Taretz Nusach Shalanu, in order to sustain our version, where we do have the word lafare. Shebatel, the reason why the customs of Egypt to refer to the Egyptian kings as Pharaoh is gone is mipnei shebemitzias Mitzrayim, because with the exodus from Egypt, Yardam Mitzrayim Migadlusa, Egypt went down from its glory of being a superpower. Being a superpower is thanks to the Jewish people in your country. And if the Jewish people leave your country, you're no longer a superpower. So it continues. VoEkach, and then afterwards, Hoisa, there was, top of page 8, Baliyas Ve'yerides. Egypt went up and down in power after the Exodus. And there were other countries that conquered it. Rome was in charge of it for a while. Alexander the Great was in charge of it. All kinds of people took over before then. The Persians, the Medes, all kinds of countries overpowered them. But, and now he quotes the Haggadah, if God would have not taken us out of Egypt, Egypt would have remained a superpower. They were saying that the reason why a superpower is a superpower is because they're host to the Jews. And if the Jews are gone, no more superpower. So if the Jews would still be in Egypt, they would still be a superpower. And if they would still be a superpower, they would still be called pharaohs. What's the Rebbe saying? Even as slaves were responsible for their country being a superpower. Even as slaves. Which gives a whole other dimension to the Haggadah, right? The Haggadah says that we're supposed to see ourselves as if we left Egypt. Why? Because we would still be there. And some might argue, well, what do you mean? We're not free. We're subject to other nations. People were enslaved into who knows where, post-Egypt. Right? And Deb's coming and saying, even in your enslavement, you're still the chosen people. Even in your enslavement, even in Egypt, the country that you're hosting is doing well thanks to you. Even in your enslavement. Incredibly powerful notion. And Deb cites to a source, take note of the Yalkut Shimoni, it's a medrash. When the Jewish people left Egypt, the superpower of Egypt went down. Pharaoh used to be a super ruler from one end of the world to the other, because of the fact that the Jewish people were in his country. And therefore, if we were still in Egypt, all the custom, all of the nimusim is like the pleasantries, or like the what's the word? Politeness, the etiquette. The etiquette, that's the word, etiquette. all the etiquette and the customs of the kings would stay. Following? Beautiful idea. That even in our slavery, we're responsible for superpower. And the Rebbe continues and says, you must agree with my contention. Why? The Abudraham took out the word lefarai. He took out the word to Pharaoh because there's no more pharaohs. The Rebbe says you're still going to have to argue that us being there would maintain their superpower ability. Why is that? Because how is it possible? Why would you say we'll still be slaves in Egypt? Even though the king of Egypt is gone, either way, you're going to have to be stuck with the fact that ancient Egypt will remain. Because if the verse says, if the Haggadah says that had God not taken us out, we'd still be there. Let's say it didn't say Pharaoh, it just said Egypt. Egypt is not a superpower anymore. Why would we still be slaves there? You must say there would remain a superpower if we didn't go out. Good. So would Pharaoh remain if we didn't go out. Okay. So this is comment number 2 that I want to highlight today. Now, comment number 3 I want to highlight today. 2 more comments I want to share with you. And we'll conclude with that. 2 more comments. There's much more, obviously. 3 more, actually. Quick ones. So next paragraph there. Now we're skipping to, so there was comments on the Avadim Hayinu, which was the first narrative of shame to positive. So first we went through the background as to how we got to this point of shame versus positive in the various different versions. Yeah. And now we have this comment on what does it mean that we would still be slaves. Yeah. Now we get to the other paragraph, skipping the 4 sons, getting to the other version of shame to positive, which is our forefathers used to be idol worshippers. So comment number 1, the second picture on page, what page is it? 8. Mitechila of the Avodah Zarah. At the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. So here the Rebbe doesn't cite to the Gemara. He says, Niskar b'Psachim ubi Yerushalmi. It's mentioned in Psachim and Yerushalmi, meaning to say it must have existed before. But it's mentioned there because as I told you earlier,
before, ...
Yeah, so you can see the Yerushalmi right here, the picture right under that. It says there, you see the V'goymer is there? Be'evar no Yosho Yisechem, V'goymer. VoEkach Hasavichem, V'goymer, even though those are referring to Psukim. Rav Amar Mitechila. I'm not so sure if this is right, because it could be he means etc. referring to the verses, not to the Haggadah. But anyway. But the way the Rebbe frames it is not that these paragraphs come from the Gemara, because the Gemara doesn't actually say the whole paragraph. It's mentioned in the Gemara, because the Gemara says, say that paragraph, meaning it must have existed earlier already.
It was already known.
Yeah. Then the Rebbe says like this. This I think is a right comment. Okay, Mitechila of the Avodah Zarah. At the beginning, our forefathers were idol worshippers. Avosenu, our forefathers. Who is our forefathers? Who are they?
Abraham's father.
Terach, right? But what does the Rebbe quotes here from the Rambam, which says like this: B'yemei Terach, in the days of Terach, umulfanav, and before Terach. Who else is our forefathers in the days of Terach, except for Terach himself?
How can Terach be one of our forefathers if everything started from Avadim Hayinu?
Avram wasn't created from the dust like Adam was. He was created by birth of his parents. So he had a father, right?
Yeah, but we don't mention his parents.
Okay, one second. The pasuk that the Haggadah quotes, the pasuk from Yeshua, where Yeshua says, "This is what God says: Your father Terach was a idol worshiper." Right? So the pasuk refers to Terach as our father. But the way the Rebbe quotes from Rambam is in the days of Terach and before that. Who else is our father in the days of Terach except for Terach himself? So I would argue it's Avram himself. The Haggadah is not just saying that our forefathers were slaves pre-Avram, but Avram himself was an idol worshiper, and God took him. And this gets to your point mentioned right at the beginning, that what's happening here is not once upon a time there was a negative history. I have a negative history with Hashem, and then Hashem takes me. Avram himself.
He was 3 years old, and he really.
So for this, I came across, by divine providence, a couple of weeks ago, I was learning, and I came across a passage in a Maamorim from the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe says the following. I want you to go to page, fantastic line, page 9. Top, you see the picture there. This is an unbelievable, when I read it, it's like, I bookmarked it for the Haggadah, because this is amazing. It says like this, even though actually the Haggadah here, the comment here that I'm reading, this Maamorim, is a Maamorim about Lulav. But some about lulav. Lulav and etrog. It's a discourse about lulav. But in there, the Alter Rebbe talks about Avram Avinu. It's like this. Let's understand what true recognition means, which comes from the cognitive ability known as das, says the Alter Rebbe. We find a similar idea. Matzinu, we find Bavram. Sh'amar Azal, our sages say, in the Medrash, Ben Gimel Shana Hikr. Avraham was 3 years old when he discovered God, using this term Hakara, recognition. Continues the Alter Rebbe, Ki terach aviv, because Terach, the father of Avraham, avad l'shemesh v'yareach, he served the sun and the moon. The kodim shehikir l'boira amiti, before Abraham recognized and got to know the true creator, he too, before 3 years old, would also serve the sun and the moon. This is where I was like, wow. But keep on, listen to how he describes it. But Avram Avinu's service of the sun and moon was within great enthusiasm that comes with the cognitive ability called das. Because Avram Avinu thought in his mind at the time that the sun was the creator. And he all day long was enthralled with this piece of information: the sun created the world. And he never forgot this fact for a moment. And his thoughts were completely distracted by this notion alone. The sun is my creator. This is the notion of das, this cognitive ability called das, which is the opposite of forgetfulness. Forgetfulness comes from being distracted from thought. But so long as the person's awareness is there, he can't cut about, he can't forget about it. And therefore, as soon as Avram realized at 3 years old that that the sun is not a creator, but a created creation, because he realized the sun is setting, as our sages explain, and he got to know and recognize the true creator, with the very same cognitive strength that he used to serve the sun and moon, now he served God. In what fashion? He never forgot for a moment the fact that God created everything. So what do we have here from the Alter Rebbe? That not only was Avram Avinu an idol worshiper at 2.5 and 3 years old, an enthusiastic one, and with the same enthusiasm he came to serve Hashem later. Right? So maybe then, when the Rambam and then the Rebbe says that our forefathers are referring to, even though the Haggadah says later, VoEkach I took your forefather Terach, Bimei Terach, in the era of Terach. The era of Terach, our forefathers, the only other forefather we have in the era of Terach is Abraham. And he also was an idol worshiper. And he too, God says, I'm taking you out to be mine. So don't worry about your history. And Rebbe's going to add here one more comment. You have to hear this. The last comment. What? Yeah, right. Yeah, one last comment because you hear this. This is amazing. So then it says, what does Haggadah say? Go back to page. What page is it? Look at the text Haggadah. What page is the text Haggadah?
8 is the comment.
No, the actual Haggadah is on page 3. Mitechila, at the beginning of David, our forefathers were idol worshippers. Our forefathers were. Yeah, we discussed this already. Our forefathers probably means Avraham also. Then it says, the Akshav. And now, God brought us close to his service. What do you mean now? He brought us close to his service when? Way back then. What do you mean now? What are you saying now for? It should say, and afterwards Hashem brought us close. Yeah? So says the Rebbe, Achshav, back to the Rebbe's comment on page 8. First of all, the Rebbe says, Yesh Koshvin Achshav b'Yud. There are some that spell the word Achshav with a Yud. Aleph, Chaf, Shin, Yud, Vav. They don't need it. Okay, so it's no Vav. Then the Rebbe says, HaKeruv, Hashem bringing us close to him, wasn't the time of Avraham. This adds to that narrative. He himself was an enthusiastic idol worshiper. And then God says, no, I'm taking you. Because it is a continuous action till this very day that Hashem is plucking us out. Just like, what did the Haggadah say? The Haggadah is responding to the kid. Why are we sitting around the table here? Response number one is because we were slaves, now we're out. And if we weren't out, we would still be slaves, and Pharaoh would still be a superpower. Now, in the second answer, what do we tell him? Oh, why are we here? Because we used to be idol worshippers, and now we're serving God. Now we're serving God. We've been serving God for thousands of years. Says Zagada, no, now God is taking you to be his servant. It's continuing to happen now. Therefore, us now too have to thank him for it. That's why the Haggadah says, and now, and not afterwards. Our forefathers were slaves, and afterwards God took us out. No. Now he takes us out. He's continuously taking us out. Whole new meaning to Haggadah. And on both ends, number one, you should know that even while you're enslaved, you're still a Jewish people. Even when you're enslaved, the whole world is a superpower dependent on where you live. That's number one. And number two, even though you could be like an Avadim Hayinu, an enthusiastic idol worshiper, even now God can take you out of Egypt. Now here at the Seder, and Rebbe does this not by altering the word, but by pointing out the precise language of the word. Avos Hayinu, our forefathers, Avraham, Achshav now, not Achakach then. The precise language of the Haggadah itself. The same thing before, where the Haggadah said we would still be slaves in Egypt. So you can take it as metaphor, no, literally, we would still be slaves because they would still be a superpower. The Haggadah says that our forefathers were slaves. We're idol worshippers. Yes, our forefathers of Avram Avinu himself. And the Haggadah says, now we serve him. Not because now, right now. So no matter where the person stands in his life, comes the Haggadah and says, you're not as an enthusiastic idol worshipper as Avram was. And even if you were, now Hashem can take you out. There's a whole new dimension to what we're thanking Hashem for that, the Haggadah, without altering one meaning of the word. And in fact, giving more precise meaning of the word. This is the beauty of the Rebbe's commentary. Stays mamish literal to the text, but it gives us a whole beautiful insight. All right, didn't a wonderful night. God willing, next week, same time. Good night.
Sorry.